one last question. I could have 3 or 4 more on this labor front. Is one response to the sort of globalization of companies has been a kind of globalization of industrial relations where you create agreements that cross national boundaries. And Christy, I know you did one with this company, ISS, Danish company that manages lots of facilities, 500,000 employees. For those of us like me who are not familiar with how this works, what is a global framework agreement? How do you get a company to agree to it? Have any U.S. companies signed these yet? Do they cover contract employees as well as actual employees? Give us a quick primer based on that experience.
So I would say that UNI broadly, and my focus is property services, but UNI has all the sectors Mark mentioned earlier, puts a priority on negotiating global agreements with multinational employers. And these will vary, depending on the sector. UNI has about 20 global agreements. I've got quite a few in my sector. The basic framework of a global agreement is to establish a commitment from the employer that it will recognize and adhere to the ILO core conventions and respect national law, which one might think, well, that should be obvious. Every company should do that. But in fact, that's a big step in and of itself, because obviously employers are not individually obligated by the core conventions. They're binding on states. So this is a positive step. Although we've also taken the position that just reiterating the obligation to respect freedom of association isn't enough. In our global agreement with ISS, we've also achieved some very specific commitments to respect both the right and create practical opportunities for workers around the world to create unions. And so we think that it's got to go beyond just respecting the ILO core conventions, but also have a little more in the agreement that actually turns these rights into a reality. And third, in the ISS agreement, and sort of in parallel with John Ruggie's proposal that the CSR agenda, in order to really ensure rights, there should be a remedy. We think it's important that global agreements have some opportunity for disputes to get resolved by a neutral third party. And we've agreed in this agreement with ISS to binding arbitration in the event there are disputes. And that's unusual. Most global framework agreements don't have that. We're working towards that end. We think in order to provide a real transparent process and real rights, that should be an important element. I just want to say that beyond the obligations that ISS has incurred in this process, that we've negotiated some things that really work towards ISS's benefit, apart from just giving them a positive image of negotiating this agreement. I mean, one is we've agreed that our aim as a global union is to raise standards across market, not just to target one employer. They're a big multinational employer with lots of small firm competitors. They operate in 80 countries. So we've agreed that we will raise the floor, try to knock out the bottom feeders, if you will, those companies that don't pay any wages or certainly below minimums. We've also agreed, of course, that we will treat each other with civility, and I think that it's important when you're looking at a global company in 80 countries with decentralized management that there will be problems that will come up. It's not always pretty when you scratch the surface in Thailand or Malaysia or wherever. These are cleaners. These are women, very low-wage cleaners, and many times, there are problems. It is in their interest to have a global partner to try to resolve these problems with. And I think that that practice of how we are going to deal with problems is important. And thirdly, in order to deal with some of these markets where the standards are very low, we've agreed to create a jointly managed fund to put some resources into the pot on how we can raise standards. Why did they agree to this? I think it's a Danish company with pretty strongly embedded cultural preference for dealing with unions. At least it's really not accepted in Denmark to be branded as anti-union. But I think it's risk management. Clearly there's an element of that. I think that they see the benefit of working to raise standards across markets. it's in their interests in terms of their own income to have the standards be higher when your industry is to provide contract employees. So I think that's clearly an incentive for them. It's good for their image.
Let me just interrupt you. Have any other companies, big companies we would know of, signed these global frameworks, and any U.S. companies?
No U.S. companies apart from Chiquita. Quite a few European countries. It has been more of a European phenomenon. We are just in the process now of negotiating with some very big UK-based companies, and that will be a breakthrough for that market. But it's primarily been a phenomenon that's begun in Europe. And we certainly see this as the path in the future, that there will be globalized industrial relations. There is enough on the positive side for companies to do these kinds of agreements with global unions. So I think it's only a matter of time before some U.S. companies sign.
And we're seeing it spread to two other forms of dialogue and agreement. One is around migrant or temporary migrant workers, where you're starting at the ground up. I mean, we've signed agreements in Australia because we couldn't bear the exploitation with companies who were decent have then become global agreements because they understand that gives them a ticket to mobility across the globe, and that's pretty powerful from their perspective. We've also got now across the global unions federations dialogues going on about certainty of supply, so from the mine to the factory or the factory floor through the transport and logistics corridor and off to sea. Big advantage for employers for fundamentally engaging in appropriate relations with their employers. But if you're really going to globalise industrial relations, then what Christy stresses is absolutely fundamental, and that's the power of remedy of grievance. It works for you and it works for us if you mitigate extremes of power. I think you asked Christy that question earlier. And you get respect for agreements. In the private sector, if you had a contract with a supplier and they actually, didn't engage in respecting it, then you'd have them in the courts tomorrow. Well, fundamentally, people have to have confidence that their rights are going to be respected, and agreements where you cut a deal will be in place.
We were going to take some time on environmental issues, but I want to go to the audience. Let's just, one quick question, a general one. What do you see as the role of organized labor in helping to solve big environmental problems, particularly climate change? I know you've been involved, Sharon.
Well, my nightmare at the moment in terms of the fallout from the financial unravelling in terms of governance is jobs. We're all losing jobs, we're all seeing them go, and unless we bring on the capacity we've all got for now dealing with the climate change issues, but other environmental issues as well, and growing green jobs fast, and indeed looking at the infrastructure back that requires, then we are going to lose time and the world's going to be a more impoverished place. The ILO's figures are frightening. Tip of the iceberg, at least 20 million jobs lost, to 100 million people going backwards on living on less than $2 a day. We think that just from my little part of the world, we just released a study last week that shows that we can have a $250 billion industry in green products within a decade or two as part of what will be a $3 trillion industry by 2020. Globally. And it's about half of that now. There's big opportunities, but it really requires us to invest in R&D jointly, in not just R&D in terms of product design and development, but in application, transfer of skills. And I think the obvious ones are energy efficiency and cross use of skills from one sector of development to another. But there are companies here, the other big ones, biomaterials, absolutely the future, whether it's manufacturing generally or textiles or wherever you might go. But there are companies here, GE, I've just done some work with GE in the Asia Pacific, fabulous thinking around creativity and design. There are others I saw on the list that we're all engaged in discussing. And so when you look at the global investment, whether it's energy, biomaterials, service jobs in the green sector, we've got to get amongst it right now, and that requires skills, because the biggest impediment to companies growing jobs and being part of that green products market is the skills base.